now the problems in the banking sector, which have very rapidly affected many other countries around the world. I think while the reasons for the crisis are multifaceted and in some ways complicated, certainly directors and boards have not been blameless in terms of the current problems and difficulties. I think the work of the Bulgarian Corporate Governance Task Force, as Florian mentioned just now, in developing corporate governance guidelines for companies here in Bulgaria, provides an important foundation for companies in their ability to navigate through the current crisis. I think what's important to emphasize always with corporate governance codes is that it's not the compliance with them alone that matters. In fact, what's really important is substantively implementing and understanding the nature of the guidance as provided by the corporate governance code, and then to really seek to ensure that it works in the company for reasons that improve the economic sustainability of the company and its profitability. It's not an issue of compliance alone. I should perhaps at this point just make the point that my background primarily is in the private sector, having worked for a large multinational mining company in a senior capacity, and prior to that with a large family-owned business in the electronics sector. And it's very interesting seeing these dimensions of governance at work in the boardroom of companies like that. I think, therefore, the establishment today of the Bulgarian Corporate Governance Commission is very timely. And one of its objectives is to provide guidance on the application of the recommendations contained in the Corporate Governance Code. And I think that's going to be a very important feature that will be very useful to companies and boards as they try and understand these requirements, as they try and inform their directors in terms of the application of these requirements, and as they seek to attract investment, whether it's local or international investment. What has been more recently analyzed, certainly from a very large organization in the United States covering some 4,200 companies around the world, is that even in the current crisis there are profitable companies, and it's interesting to see that these companies are still on a substantial growth path and are navigating successfully the crisis. And a lot of it seems to come down to the practices and standards of good corporate governance that they've installed both at the board level and within management. I think, however, there's still a lot of work to be done, and that's not just in Bulgaria, by the way. One of the challenges that we do have in the current environment, of course, is that the European model of comply or explain, as followed here by Bulgaria and supervised by the regulators, has worked fairly well up to now, but as we've observed, particularly in the United Kingdom, in the banking sector there, that some are beginning to question whether this approach is sufficient. On the other hand, if you look at Sarbanes-Oxley in the US with its very draconian, very rigorous rules and penalties, and then looking at the problems in the United States, that doesn't seem to have worked terribly well either. So I guess one of the challenges for international standard setters, and indeed the national regulators, such as here in Bulgaria, will be to try and find what is the right balance between voluntary compliance and mandatory enforcement. And I would imagine that the National Commission will be able to provide some useful guidance in its discussions with the regulators. As far as the actual problems or observations from the current crisis, they just seem to be very similar to all other crises, which I think for some of us is rather depressing and disappointing. One is ineffective board oversight. Again, directors not really paying attention to the business of the company, and in some cases not understanding the complexity of the business, particularly in the banking sector. Ineffective audit committees, which are poorly constructed and not really fulfilling their work and interrogating the information that's provided to them by management. Inadequate internal controls and risk management, of which I'll deal a little bit more with. And certainly in some of the markets, the absence of any active shareholders, which could have probably tested companies in their behavior and the quality of their reporting. I think what's more disturbing is when you look at some of the examples, such as Lehman Brothers, where a board of 9 directors or so comprised, 4 of those directors were over 75 years old, and I'm not casting aspersions on people's age here, But among them was interesting. One was a theatre producer, and another one was a former Navy admiral of one of the one of the world's, at that time, largest financial institutions, operating in some very sophisticated and complex areas of the financial market. So one has to really question the wisdom and judgment that boards often exercise in the directors that they appoint and the way they think about that process. And I can give you many, many other examples where sometimes it just, when you look at it, the logic of what the boards are doing and the way they're appointing their directors just doesn't make business sense, let alone anything else. As I mentioned just now, there's some debate to what extent corporate governance was responsible for the current crisis. And I think, as I mentioned just now, boards and directors weren't entirely blameless. The real issue comes down to the basic fundamental provisions of the Bulgarian Corporate Governance Code. And that is good corporate governance is about boards directing and controlling their organization, not managing the organization, but providing strategic direction and thoughtful input to management's decisions and proposals, so that they operate in the shareholders' interests, whether that's the controlling shareholders or other minority shareholders. There should be no distinction. And I think one of the things certainly that the code provides is some guidance in that area. What's also important to point out, in my opinion, that corporate governance is not just something for companies that are listed on the stock exchange. It's equally important where public funds and taxes are also at risk, such as in state-owned corporations and municipal-owned companies. I think also the other thing that in the guidance that was provided by the Bulgarian Corporate Governance Code is very useful, and it does provide a sound platform on which you can base business decisions. But like all codes, anywhere in the world, there's always room for improvement. And I'm sure as you gain experience from the application of your code here in Bulgaria, the Commission, no doubt, will be looking to enhance those provisions. Another distinction that one has to look at also is the issue between corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, because very often these issues get very muddled. And corporate governance is really representative of the system by which a company conducts its business, the way it makes decisions, and the way it reports on those decisions in terms of its performance and any strategic or important matters that affect its operation. Corporate social responsibility really embraces around that all the banks or the financiers of the business, the employees and the communities and so forth that are dependent on those decisions. But in my opinion, at the outset, you've got to get the